But of course, George Lucas always had it in mind that they were brother and sister. Bullshit! I've never understood what is wrong with that approach. I think I prefer, turn it off, turn it off! It's a lightsaber, not a laser blade. Did you just do the sound effect? Yeah, I think it is wishful thinking. But the question is, who is this bandy-legged stranger? If you haven't seen part 1 of this review, then I suggest you check it out now. If you don't want to watch part 1 and just want to watch this episode, which is a bit weird, then let me explain what we're doing. We are reviewing the 1980 Marvel Comics adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back, and we're doing it by looking at 3 different versions. Version 1 is the serialised version that was published in 6 parts from issues 39 to 44 of the ongoing Star Wars comic that had started back in 1977. Version 2 is Marvel Super Special issue 16, which was released in the summer of 1980 and collected together all 6 parts of the adaptation into 1 volume. Another single volume version is this little fella, which was published by Arrow Books. The colours vary throughout, especially in the Arrow Books version where Carl Gafford provides the colours, instead of Glennis Wine who did the job on the other versions. If you want more background info than that, watch episode 1. What's wrong with you? Issue 42 has a cover that would serve as a template for the Return of the Jedi limited series, as artist Al Williamson puts 3 characters in the spotlight. Straight out of the blocks in the serialisation, of course, we get an extra Al Williamson splash page showing the bounty hunters and also Luke and R2 shortly after they arrived on Dagobah. But it's really on the next page that Al begins to really convey the atmosphere of Dagobah with that thick, swampy jungle. And of course, Luke feels like we're being watched. And there he is, Yoda. Actually, I'm being a bit disingenuous, because in the serialised version, we get the version of Yoda that we know and love. In the Arrow Books version, the version that was finalised, that went to the presses before these other versions, we get this odd purple-skinned creature. Now, throughout the whole of this adaptation, Marvel had access to various production stills, reference photos, that kind of thing. But the Arrow Books version was the first one to go to print. And at that point, all they had for Yoda was Ralph McQuarrie's concept art, which time and time again showed Yoda as this more kind of gnome-like creature. By the time the other versions went to print, Lucasfilm had been able to provide a photo of the actual Yoda puppet. So in all of those versions, we get the correct, accurate green Yoda. There are a few other moments, of course, that differ from the film, but none quite as noticeable as that. One example, in fact, is how Luke responds when he first sees Yoda. In the film, he draws his gun. In the comic, it's not entirely clear, but is that his lightsaber he's drawn? The magazine version, with its stronger colours, doesn't really make it any clearer. But it's in the book, with Carl Gafford's alternative colours, where he does ever so subtly show that yes, indeed, Luke has drawn his lightsaber. So that's intriguing. Was there an alternate shot of that scene? So there's the one where Luke draws his pistol that we're all familiar with, and one where he draws his lightsaber. But ultimately, I guess it ended up on the cutting room floor. Interesting. Otherwise, the only other variations in this scene are very minor ones in the dialogue, where I guess as they were shooting it, they discovered that when the actors delivered their lines one way rather than the other, they worked a bit better. Anyway, for now we're going to leave Luke and Yoda and join our other heroes who are hiding out in a meteor that is being bombed by Star Destroyers. In fact, all the time that the heroes are in the asteroid field, we don't see any TIE bombers or TIE fighters at all. 3PO, of course, is trying to work out what's wrong with the ship's hyperdrive, and they've dropped one of Han's lines here, which is a shame. Because in the film, he says,
"Here, Chewie. I think we better replace the negative power coupling."
Whereas in the comic, although he says to 3PO, of course we'll have to replace it, he then just tells Chewie to replace it. which makes him come across more bossy than bluffing his way through the situation as he does in the film. We get lots of Han and Leia, with Han saying things like he thinks she hasn't had enough scoundrels in her life, although her line about happening to like nice men is dropped. Before we join Darth Vader, as he communicates with old Monkey Eyes himself. The Emperor's look is actually even more ambiguous here than it is in the film, the original version, that is. Vader suggests that Luke could be a powerful ally if he could be turned, which, of course, the Emperor agrees with. The strange thing is that in the book version, they give that first line to the Emperor. So suddenly he is saying that Luke could be a powerful ally if he could be turned. Things are then made really awkward when we're told that for a long moment the huge holograph just flickers silently before the Emperor then agrees. What did they think was happening in that scene? That he was talking to himself? Oh, don't mind me, I'm just thinking out loud. Back on Dagobah, we get the great scene where Luke discovers that he is actually speaking to Yoda, whether it be Ralph McQuarrie's Yoda or Stuart Freeborn's. His speech isn't entirely Yoda-esque yet. Now and again it is, but then also a lot of the time he just speaks kind of normally, in terms of his grammar. For example, instead of saying, "For 800 years have I trained Jedi," he says, "I have trained Jedi for 800 years. What do you want, a medal? It's just not the same, is it? It's just a bit, I don't know, uninteresting. Back in the asteroid field, there's some really interesting things going on with the colours. In the book, Carl Gafford once again goes for a colder palette, whereas Glynis Wine goes for colours that are more intestinal, giving a bit of a clue to the true nature of their location. The Falcon isn't attacked by Minocs, no. It is attacked by some kind of Minoc, which begs some interesting questions for Star Wars zoologists. Then there are some additional clues in the dialogue as to the true nature of the cave, as we're told that the asteroid has the strangest consistency and that the ground isn't like rock at all. Then as they escape their fate, it's Glynis Wine's colours that are more cryptic and Carl Gafford's that make their predicament more obvious. We don't actually get to see the space slug, but that was intentional. There were some aspects of the film that Lucasfilm wanted to be kept a secret from the prospective audience until they went to actually see the film, and the space slug was one of them. Luke is still training with Yoda, and actually we get some really good extra stuff here. There's a training exercise with a metal bar, before Luke then complains about being tired, and he says that he thought he was in good shape. "Yes, but by what standard, ask I? Forget your old measures. Unlearn. Unlearn." Plus, we still get all the other stuff, like Luke's X-Wing being lifted out of the swamp, and him saying, "I don't believe it," and Yoda saying, "That is why you fail." On Darth Vader's Star Destroyer, this is going to blow your mind, because with the bounty hunters assembled, and yes, another great bit of art from Al Williamson, Darth Vader says to Boba Fett, "You and your band are highly regarded. Do not disappoint me." So the other bounty hunters work for Boba Fett. I assumed that they were all independent. I suppose that explains why Darth Vader says no disintegrations specifically to Boba Fett, because he's the man in charge. As the man in charge, he also gets some additional lines that weren't in the film. This issue builds to a climax as the Millennium Falcon attaches itself to one of the Star Destroyers. Something which, due to some awful editing in the book, just isn't clear, as the Millennium Falcon is hidden behind a word balloon. It's the Empire is supposed to be hiding from, not us. As has happened before, we have an additional splash page in the serialization of it, which isn't in the other versions. It doesn't really add anything to the story because we get a very similar picture straight after it, but it does add to the page count, which, oh, by the way, great Han Solo picture. The page count must have been particularly low on this issue because after this instalment of the story, we get a gallery featuring covers from the UK Star Wars comic. The pencils in all of these are by Carmine Infantino, and they're not very good. We follow Han's next move in the very next issue, where after the customary additional splash page, we see that Cloud City really is served very well by these comics. Now in the film, I just assumed it was sunset, or sunrise I suppose, but here it is explained to us that that is not the case. It explains that the clouds are shot with pink, which is reflected from the gaseous surface of the planet below. And whether it's the subtler colours of the serialisation or the stronger colours of both the magazine version and the book version, it always looks gorgeous. However, the warm colour palette is quickly abandoned in the book, and in fact they choose their own colour scheme for various characters, such as Lando, Lobot and the Cloud City Guards. I can only assume their reference photos were black and white. We get to appreciate how well C-3PO is drawn briefly before, what, is he shot? Because it doesn't show it. This is the last we see of him in one piece. Then we return to Dagobah. Now, Al Williamson is great. Just look at his pictures of Han and Lando. So, what's happened here with Luke? And that's not the only one. I mean, I don't want to say it, but is this what happens when Al doesn't have source material to swipe from? It seems that C-3PO really was shot as Chewbacca brings his disassembled body back to Leia's chambers, before Lando then takes them all on a surprise dinner date with the Dark Lord himself. Back on Dagobah, Al Williamson shows that he's back on form, not just in how he infuses the atmosphere of the planet into the pictures, but also with some great renderings of Obi-Wan and Luke as he prepares to leave the planet. Strangely, a lot of the quality of that Obi-Wan picture is lost in the versions with stronger colours. There is a small but significant change in dialogue here as well. In the film, Luke confronts a vision of Vader in a cave on Dagobah. Here, that confrontation still happens, but we're told that it isn't in a cave, it is in the roots of a large tree. But looking at the visuals, they don't look terribly different from what we got in the film. So I would suggest that the location hasn't actually changed, but how it is referred to has. Maybe when they saw the dailies, they decided that actually it looks more like a cave, and all this talk of a tree is just going to confuse the audience, because they'll be thinking, well, when's Luke going to get to this tree? Maybe he needs to go through the cave to get to it. Who knows? Here it is most definitely referred to as a tree, even down to Yoda's line of, "The tree! Remember your failure at the tree." I'm losing it, aren't I? And then Luke leaves, giving us one last view of the wonderfully atmospheric Dagobah. There's another change in dialogue on Cloud City, but it's so tiny it makes you wonder why they bothered. In the Arrow Books version, Lando says to Darth Vader that his troopers had said something about them never leaving the city. But in the serialised version, troopers has become men. Like I said, what's the point? And then we get a couple more great images of Darth Vader lurking around the bowels of Bespin. Now, I know we've had some extra pages before to fill out the page count, but look at this. Now, I know it doesn't add to the story, and I suppose we didn't need to see Luke flying towards Cloud City. We know he left Dagobah in the X-Wing, and we know he arrived at Cloud City. But even so, there's some great work here that just can't be found in any of the other versions. At that same time, Vader and Boba Fett are discussing putting Han in the freezing chamber. A perfectly decent panel, completely destroyed by some awful editing in the book. I mean, surely they could have come up with a better solution. And this leads up to one of the greatest moments in the trilogy, in fact, one of the greatest moments in the entire Star Wars saga. As Leia says to Han, "Han, oh Han, I love you. I couldn't tell you before, but it's true." And Han says, "Just remember that, Leia, 'cause I'll be back." One of the greatest lines, not only in Star Wars, but in cinema history. It's not even there. Completely done away with. I mean, what next? Maybe Darth Vader did kill Luke's father after all. Okay. Well, of course, we know what's happened here, don't we? Because that line, the line of "I know," as much as it's famous, it is also well known that it was ad-libbed. That Harrison Ford did deliver a couple of other variations, a couple of other responses to Leia, and I guess one of them probably was, "Just remember that, Leia, 'cause I'll be back." And then he said, actually, can I try something? Just see what happens. And he came out with the now famous,
I know.
So of course it's not in here because that line was never a part of the script. So it makes sense that it's not in here. We finished the issue with Han, of course, being put into the freezing chamber. And then, once again, as with the last issue, we have some bonus pages. This time, it's not covers from the Marvel UK comic, it's just Star Wars pin-ups from various Marvel artists, including Terry Austin, John Byrne, and Frank Miller. Okay, time to conclude this adaptation of arguably the greatest movie sequel ever. I think I know how it ends, but the way things have gone so far, you can never be too certain. We have one last splash page before Lando confirms that Han is alive and in perfect hibernation. Vader tells Calrissian his tweaked plan, which is that yes, Leia and Chewbacca will stay in Cloud City, but so too will a garrison of stormtroopers. Rather than in the film, when he's told that Leia and the Wookiee need to be taken to Darth Vader's ship. Of course, Lando protests the idea of having a garrison in Cloud City, and then something interesting happens. When Lando begins to protest, Darth Vader, as well as delivering his line about altering the bargain, pray I don't alter it further, briefly force chokes Lando. Now that's interesting, because in the film there is a brief moment where Lando just touches his neck, and I thought he was doing it kind of to show his nervousness. But maybe it's the leftovers of a cut shot where this actually happened, where Vader briefly choked him. We then get the familiar action of Luke in the corridors of Bespin as he tries to rescue Leia and Chewie, before the inevitable confrontation with Darth Vader, with, I'm happy to report, some additional dialogue. For a start, Luke tries a bit of trash talking. And then later in the fight, Darth Vader says, "The fear does not reach you. You've learned more than I anticipated." To which Luke responds with the familiar, "You'll find I'm full of surprises." Whilst Lando helps Leia and Chewbacca escape, the duel between Luke and Vader continues for the best part of the comic, which is great because it gives Al Williamson more opportunities to show us how well he does atmosphere. When the moment arrives that Luke loses his hand, we aren't shown it explicitly, and even when we're told about it, it's in something of a riddle. We're told the Dark Lord's blade comes slicing through part of the gantry equipment to strike Luke's sword arm. We're also told that pain seizes the young warrior, his weapon falls, and the hand that grasped it will never grasp anything again. So okay, we can join the dots, but they could have shown it being cut off, couldn't they? There didn't have to be any blood. After all, there was no blood in the film. Then comes the climactic, oft-quoted denouement of the film as they discuss what happened to Luke's father. As Luke says, "Ben told me enough. He told me you killed my father." Close enough. And Vader says, "No, Luke, I am your father." And Luke, seeing that he has no other choice, takes the plunge. As we all know, Slave One has escaped our heroes, but they still have the opportunity to escape Cloud City, and they do so. But as they leave, Leia hears Luke calling out to her using the Force. Now, initially, when he's hanging off of that weather vane underneath Cloud City, in the film, he calls out to Ben. He also calls out to Ben here in exactly the same way. However, here, Darth Vader is the one that hears that call, and he responds using the Force, saying, "Ben cannot help you now, my young Jedi." But he doesn't follow it up, assuming that any moment now Luke is going to fall to his death to the planet's surface below. Of course he doesn't. The others rescue him, and as soon as I saw this next page, I knew it was one of those additional splash pages. But it's a corker, and again, the other versions are all the poorer for not including it. And we're pretty much done, but not before we see another dubious Al Williamson illustration of Luke. as he mutters, "I won't be able to resist him this time. Ben, why didn't you tell me?" Then R2 fixes the hyperdrive after the city's central computer told him. The Falcon makes the leap. Darth Vader stalks off silently, and we see our heroes go their separate ways, agreeing to meet up on Tatooine. All together now. Da 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 da. An enjoyable adaptation of a great film draws to a close. But if I could only choose one of our 3 versions to keep for posterity, which would it be? Reading it in the book version was an unusual but no less enjoyable experience. However, the reassembling of the layouts to fit the pages and the sometimes baffling choice of colours have to knock this one out of the running for me, even though it does have that exclusive Ralph McQuarrie version of Yoda. The Marvel Super Special version is great in the hand due to its magazine proportions and thickness. Like the book, it collects the whole story into one volume, plus it has those vibrant colours. However, for me, as someone who is a bit of a completist, in case you hadn't noticed, I would have to go for the serialised version in the comic. Sure, the colours are muted and the printing isn't as sharp as in the other versions, but that extra content means it has to get my vote. Whichever version you read, it's always interesting seeing the alternate takes of well-known scenes, the what-ifs, and also getting those little extra tidbits of information that help you reinterpret a scene that you thought you already knew well. Of course, being a part of the ongoing Star Wars series meant that the writers of that title, of which there were many, could have fun showing the heroes searching for Han, until The Return of the Jedi came out. When that film did come out, it saw not only the return of Luke, Leia and Han to our screens, but also the return of writer Archie Goodwin and artist Ad Williamson for the adaptation. But before we look at that, we've got to look at something else.